All right, so a number of you, I understand, were here last time, and I'm not going to go into the detail I did last time, but I'm going to give sort of the Reader's Digest version of things that are happening in older suburban areas, just so everybody is kind of up to speed. And I should preface that by saying it's not just, these effects that we're going to talk about aren't really just seen in older suburban areas, they're seen in any city. It's just varying degrees, and they tend to concentrate in older suburban areas. So if you represent an area that doesn't have an old suburban area or won't be old for another 30 years, just take this in that sort of a context. This really applies to everybody, just in varying degrees. So I was here last year and I talked to you a lot about what it meant to be a first-tier suburb and some of the challenges we face. I'm going to review some of that information. I'm going to talk a little more about what other cities are doing to try to head off those specific challenges. And Gordon's got some data that we've accumulated that he'll be talking about with respect to our SACOG area specifically, and some of the metrics we've tried to apply to our suburban areas and other developed areas to figure out how healthy we are. And then finally, at the end, we want to talk about where should we go from here. Are there opportunities for peer learning among our agencies? Is there some collaboration we could undertake as a group to sort of look at these issues, or just what are those options? So let me start off. What is a first-tier suburb? They're called lots of things. Inner ring suburbs, inner suburbs, first-ring suburbs. They're often called neglected, declining, poorer suburbs. All sorts of acronyms are defined around these things. But basically what they are suburban areas that are designed usually post-1950, but occasionally they're older than that. And they're usually built sort of quickly. Didn't have a lot of jobs in their development. They're dominated by residential. You sort of know it when you see it, what this heavily suburban development type is. In California, these are really 1945 to 1970 boom towns. That's where you see the most significant effects. In the rest of the country, they can be a lot older. They can actually be suburban developments that started in the 1800s and are now suffering as a result of these same effects. It just happened a little faster here. Probably because we had some more risk factors, which I'll mention in the next slide. So how many are there in the country? Well, about 20% of Americans live in a first-tier suburb. What could be defined as a first-tier suburb? And this is some HUD data sort of boiled down. There are about 1,700 of those suburbs or cities around the country. And the majority of them are in some kind of trouble. And the way HUD defined that was if you've lost 5% of your population and you've got 20% of your population living below the median income or in poverty, living in poverty, you got 20% of your population living in poverty, then you're in trouble as a city. And that's sort of a metric I see, I don't know where it came from. Somebody decided 20% is a break point and 40% is a break point. If anyone wants to discover where that came from, I'm kind of curious myself. But anyway, looking at all those suburbs in the country, about half of them are in trouble, those old suburbs. There's a small set, 12%, that are called elite suburbs. Those are usually suburbs that were built at the absolute upper end of the market and have stayed there for their entire history. Or they're in areas that you've run out of land. The Bay Area would be sort of the classic example of this. There's no other place to go. So if you started as a nice suburb and there's not a nicer place to move up to because of the geography, this is where you are. You can maintain elite status. About a third of these old suburbs are just stable. They're somewhere in between, being elite and prosperous and starting to fail. So, thank you. Risk factors for these suburbs are pretty well established by people who have looked at them. If you've got any one of these characteristics, you're at greater risk. If you've got multiple of these risk factors, you're at enormous risk. So, for example, rapid growth, 1945 to 1980, the faster you grew, the greater your risk. If you had because that generates generational waves and service demands, right? If you grow really fast, you sell a whole bunch of homes of the same size and value to the same age people, all their kids go to school at the same time, they all graduate from high school roughly at the same time. You have this big wave, demographic wave going through the community. All the houses age at the same rate, they all break at the same rate. People start deciding whether to stay or move at the same time. And so you get these big waves that are sort of unusual in real estate, but very common in suburban areas. If you've got large swaths of similar homes, you're at risk. So cookie cutter suburbs where every house is between 200,000 and 250,000, you've got 3,000 of these, that's a risk factor. If you've got moderate home values, this is the majority of what we're building around Sacramento, moderate home values are a higher risk. If you're an upper end community, you have a chance to stay there. If you're moderate homes, higher risk. If you don't have a sense of place or a major attractor that makes you stand out, you're at risk. That can be that can be a big employer. That can be something, I don't know, cultural, something really special that sets you aside, you can be at risk. And if there's anything else new growing around you, you're at risk of becoming sort of on the downside of the first tier suburb problem. The key problem that you see in all these cities is that the income declines in those communities due to competition. So what typically happens is wealthier residents who have more ability to move somewhere else, if there's another choice available, will make that choice. More often they will move to the nicer community, the newer community, and the buyer who replaces them in that neighborhood, chances are, odds are, has less income than the person who's leaving. And that cycle repeats. And as that happens, as those lower income residents replace the original residents, then their ability to fix it up, maintain it, is diminishing because they are lower income. And it just, that cycle continues on, sort of a downward spiral. Trying to interrupt this cycle is the main therapy for what you try to do if you're a declining suburb or an older suburb or worried about the future of your suburban development. So the other thing that's going on is a change in demographics nationwide, where poverty resides. Historically, and still, most people will probably say it's in the inner cities, it's downtown. That was true in 2000, by the 2010 census, no longer true. The majority of people living in poverty live in old suburbs, not downtown. And you can look, this is Sacramento-specific data, you can look and see where that has happened. Where our population is, the poor population in 2012, we had 82,000 in the urban core, 139,000 living in suburbs. That's a 21% increase in the urban core of poor population from 2000 to 2012, but it's a 48% increase in the suburbs. And if you look at poor living in 20% poverty census tract, so that's concentrated poverty, a lot of poor people living in a relatively small area. In the urban core, that describes 66%. In suburbia, that describes 44% for Sacramento, but look at the changes. Concentrated poverty is actually decreasing in the urban core in Sacramento. It's increasing in the suburbs. So we can see this switch happening right here in Sacramento. The poor in Sacramento aren't living down here in downtown Sacramento. They're living in the suburbs. This is a map. I think I got this from the New York Times. They had a nice little data service available. And it just shows, and don't worry about it too much, the darker it is, the more poverty is present in a given census tract. And you can just sort of look at our region if you can figure out some of the defining factors. And there are others of these available online. And see where this pattern of poverty is. So for reference, Folsom's right here. I think this is Davis. Elk Grove is right down here. You can see the path of the Sacramento River and the American River. So it's interesting to see where it is with respect to...
are the darker colors?
Darker is more impoverished.
Okay.
So the worst case scenario is you have this declining median income cycle. The wealthier people are moving to the newer suburb. They're leaving behind successively poorer and poorer generations of homeowners in the old suburb, and you end up with this concentrated poverty. You know, that 20% or more in a census tract. And when you hit that point, a first-tier suburb, or any suburban setting really, doesn't have the infrastructure to deal with that concentration of impoverished people. Most of those services have been developed and built and funded in downtowns, not in suburbs. Matter of fact, all federal programs to date that are focused on poverty, suburbs don't qualify for an enormous number of them. They're focused on downtown areas, where the impoverished people no longer live. The majority, they live in suburbs. So, and with this increase in poverty in the suburbs, you get higher crime, you get lower performing schools, poor housing. You know, housing quality can decline. Owners of rental housing in those communities are less likely to reinvest because they're not sure where that market's headed. It just adds to that cycle. And besides just the local community suffering, the problem spreads, right? So if you've got one area of concentrated poverty, it's not just affecting that area. The crime that breeds, the social dysfunction that breeds, the social costs that incurs, whether it be welfare costs, judicial system costs, is borne by the entire region, not just by that community. So it's sort of in a region's interest not to allow that to happen. Don't allow the concentration to happen. Therefore, you don't have to spend as much on social welfare, you don't spend as much on the judicial system. And if you're coming from that suburban scenario, there's a lot of fiscal stress on those cities that are those first-tier suburbs. Their property, their sales tax, their income taxes nationwide are like that's 86% of revenue for cities nationwide on average. A little different here in California, but generally similar to that. And all of those are going to fall in the case where you've got this declining median income. Your property values are falling, so your property taxes are falling. The people who live there have less money, they're spending less money, you got less sales tax revenue. If you have an income tax, not in California, but nationwide, this is where you also have that impact. So at the same time that all your revenues are falling as that first-tier suburb, you also have most of your infrastructure in need of repair, because if you were a California community like Rancho, Cordova, and you were built in the 60s and 70s, your infrastructure is 40 and 50 years old, starting to break. You know, the roads are not up to spec. All of your underground infrastructure is probably not where it should be. You need to be upgrading all of your transportation systems. So at the same time you're losing revenue, you've got all that going on. You also have a very impoverished population to deal with, so there's a high service cost there. And all that intergovernmental aid is not coming to you, it's going to the downtown city where poverty used to be. So this is the big crunch that's happening on these cities. In some cases, I don't know if it's true, maybe in the LA area it's true, but in some cases, like in the Midwest, where you've got older Rust Belt cities that are having this problem, they can't even tax themselves. I mean, if they set 100% tax rates, they could not tax themselves out of the problem. They're in so deep. So here's sort of the old view, you know, of what development was like in the country. You had the suburbs and you had downtown. And downtown, that was a place that needed a lot of help, a lot of investment. As a society, we spent billions trying to fix downtown, focus on downtown, add stuff to downtown, make downtown work again. In the suburbs, that was the wonderful place to live. Everything was great, didn't have to worry about it, low crime, great schools. So the shift that's happened with these aging suburbs, and as our development patterns continue, is that now we have a diagram that looks like this. So you've got downtown where things are actually improving. All those investments probably are paying off, but something's happening. Downtown's improving. People are moving back. But now you've got inner suburbs and the sort of urban core around downtown that is the source of the crisis in the region. And then there are these, you call them collar cities, collar counties, whatever. I stole this graph from somebody else. They're doing fine. So you got your outer edge doing fine. You got this inner ring, the new donut, not doing so well. You got downtown looking healthy again. So this is sort of a national trend, and it's a shift. It's a big shift, because most of our policy is still focused this way. Most civic leaders think that way. Most chambers of commerce in big metro areas think that way. But this is the reality. So first-tier suburbs are sort of in this, we're in this crunch. We're at this decision point. You've got decreasing revenues, you've got decreasing economic capacity in general, increasing infrastructure, and increasing service demand. So you're getting squeezed from both sides, less revenue, more demands, and you have to decide what to do. Do you sort of passively wait it out, hope the market fixes it, or do you do something active to try to steer the future of your community? And that's pretty much where we are. And that's pretty much where any city can be or will be at some point with this, you know, standard pattern of property and real estate values. So at this point, we're going to switch to some data specifically that SACOG has generated, and Gordon's going to talk to us a little bit about numbers here in Sacramento.
Thank you. This data I'm going to present is what we developed from a project with University of Utah researchers. We collected, what we're going to do is sort of put some numbers to some of these concepts that we had, that we've just seen here. Let me just go back to this slide. First, we tried to sort of quantify this paradigm for our region. And there's a number of ways to do that. We have one approach here. What we've done, and let me back up, what we've done is collected data from across the country, all 70,000+ census tracts in the country for 4 time periods, 1980, 92,000 in 2010, for the census. And we did that for 13 variables. So it's a pretty significant database. The variables are all around household, workforce, characteristics. The assumption being that those characteristics are prime indicators for the community's economic health. If the household and workforce economic health, is up or down, the community is going to have the same paradigm. Let me just jump to a couple of conclusions that we have come to already, comparing what, in this case, we're calling mature suburbs. It's really the same definition compared to similar places across the country. So this is sort of an apples to apples, looking at some of these other mature suburban areas. We have a greater proportion of our region is in that category than in the country on average. The workforce development, particularly college education improvements, have lagged in these areas compared to similar areas across the country. But there are some characteristics where we do outperform the country as a whole on household income, housing occupancy or vacancy rates, home value, labor force participation, and overall education. While we lost some ground on the growth, we overall had a good response in total. And then here is a few highlights from comparing these mature suburban census tracts to other parts of the region. And again, workforce development really kind of showed as it's a place where these communities varied from the rest of the region. Median family income declined, much as Director Sanders just described. In comparison, and home values generally increased quite a bit. They still increased in these mature suburban areas, but not as much over this is actually over the period from 1990 to 2010. We got some data problems with some of the 1980 data that sort of limited our use of it. We use it where we can. The one thing that did happen, that sort of seems a bright spot, is homeowners without mortgages. That share of total homeowners increased. And what that does is, that actually mitigates some of this overall decline. Because homeowners without mortgages only have about 20 to 25% of the monthly housing cost as homeowners with mortgages, which is kind of obvious, but the amount of it is pretty dramatic. And so because they're not spending as much of their income, they do have more for other uses. So how did we apply this? This is the way we define that the new donut that you just saw. We characterize the communities by the age of the housing in those census tracts. We have for each census tract in 2010 how many were built in each decade up through back to 1940 and then everything prior to 1940. So we have how much is growth. So central cities we define 60% or older. Mature suburbs, more than 50% built from 50 to 80. These are sort of thresholds. Newer suburbs are 50% built after 1950. In the rural areas, there's this low density remainder of the region, just because we want to include everybody in this scaling, because we have scores for all census tracts. Here's a table of how that growth happened. If you look across, the numbers for each row up to 100%. That's how much of the region's housing growth happened in each of those decades. So you'll see here, between 1950 and 1980, mature suburbs clearly dominated where the housing growth was. And then it was a pretty significant shift to newer suburban areas after that. These two in total each are about 40 to 45% of the total region. So the central cities in Europe, the rural areas are less than 10% each. So you see this dramatic shift of it all got built here, and then it all shifted to other parts of the region.
What is that? Since your definitions were also based on those decades, what is that actually telling us?
It shows the degree to which that classification system actually segments pretty clearly the housing growth and the consequent problems that implies for other infrastructure. So if these numbers had not been in the 60s and 70%, but only been kind of marginally, higher than the other subparts of the other community types, it wouldn't have been a sort of as clear a message, we think, about the extent of the problem.
You're right. There's nothing particularly magic about 1980.
Well,
You can move it to 85 or 75
if you define mature suburbs as those places where the housing was built between 1950 and 1980, and then what you find is this magic statistic that most of the housing in mature suburbs were built in that period. It seems kind of apology.
It is, but it's just what I was struck by was how large that difference is between these communities and the other community types in each decade. I mean, there's this vast dominance. It isn't like, well, it's 55, 45, it's 67, it's 2/3 and 3/4. All happened in these kind of communities.
It's a wave.
Yeah, it was. It's an indicator of the wave.
I'm not understanding. I mean, the way I look at it is that's where there was land available to build housing in mature suburbs. We'll call mature suburbs now. Were newer suburbs
went
then.
first.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
So I don't get what's significant. I mean, this seems logical to me. So
Well,
It is.
It is. It certainly is. It just what struck me is how stark the growth pattern shifted around the region over time.
It'll make more sense with the next slide.
okay.
So here's
You
a
had
map
to
of
pick some
What's the big
points to compare
surprise?
against.
here's a map of those 4 areas. So central cities isn't just downtown Sacramento. There are other places where older suburban housing stock was predominant, and then didn't grow much after that. The red here is these mature suburban areas, which do exist across the region. Also, the newer suburban areas. No big surprises here, but I just want to show you that we aren't central cities. Doesn't mean downtown Sacramento.
So if you picked a different year, those
Right.
sizes would just change.
These next 3 slides are in your handouts. I'm going to go through quickly. These are the 13 variables that were collected for all of these years. So what we highlighted was data from that's pretty significant. Other things, at this level of comparison of these 4 community types, there doesn't seem to be a strong difference between them. But we have the data for all of these. Besides having 13 separate indicators, we'll also assemble these into an overall index. That right now we're looking at the weighting of it, about how you combine these 13 variables is now sort of everybody's equal. We want to explore that further. Some of these we think are clearly higher weight than others, like median family income probably has a higher weight than percent of households that are in public assistance. And so we're going to be using that to get to how can we look at an overall index score, and what does that tell us? Here's some of the numbers just behind those highlights that we showed earlier. What we want to do with this next is, before we look at what the differences across these community types, we want to start looking within the community types. What kind of variation, what kind of diversity on these variables can point to these conclusions being stronger or weaker, or are there other conclusions we can draw by looking within this at a more disaggregate level of the census tract, and stronger look at how that changes over time from 1980 to 2010. And then we also have the ability to look at this region compared to other parts of the country. Back to the standard.
So in the rest of the country where they don't have the SACOG database, nor have we plumbed it entirely yet, but the general value that you look at to try to figure out how healthy you are as a suburb is property value. and it's property value because you'd like to measure all these other things: median income, housing quality, crime rate, educational success, population changes, and you can to some degree. Some of them are harder than others, but property values as a measure are really obvious because property sells a lot. You can track it. It's well recorded. The data is available, and it parallels a lot of these other measures are buried in property value. So a lot of the focus is how do you maintain the property value or improve the property value? Because if you do that, everything else is probably kind of moving in the right direction too. So that's sort of the focus of a lot of people's intervention efforts. And if you're going to do that, you have to understand how property values actually change. And so I showed this to you guys last time. Those of you who are here, some groups find it very confusing, others get it right away. I don't know what kind of group this is. We gonna get it right away or not? Here's basically the way it works. You're a new buyer, you buy your home, your property ages, and something happens. The kitchen needs to be remodeled, bathroom needs to be fixed, you need a new roof. Whatever that is, you get to a point where you have to decide, am I gonna fix that or not? Is it worth fixing it or is it not worth fixing it? If you say yes, then you're gonna maybe expand your house, remodel your house, fix your house. You're gonna improve the property value when you make that yes, I'm gonna fix it decision. The property improves, it becomes more attractive were you to sell it to a new buyer. That sort of activity makes outside investment more likely in your neighborhood because you're fixing up your house, you're raising its value. And when you sell it, you might sell it to someone of similar economic status or even higher because it's a well-maintained property. You've increased the value by fixing it. If, on the other hand, you go the other way, you decide, I'm not going to fix it. I don't believe in the future of this neighborhood. I'm not going to live here forever. Throwing in the towel, not staying, whatever. Not worth it. Then the property value is going to decline because you didn't fix it. It's now got something wrong with it that somebody else is going to have to deal with. So the property value declines, it becomes less attractive to a new buyer. You might choose to even rent it or not improve it, leave it and rent it. That's another down factor in terms of property value. You've got lower or declining economic status of the new buyer most likely when that property is sold, and outside investment's less likely. So in your neighborhoods, in our suburban communities, you want this upper cycle to dominate, not the lower cycle. If the lower cycle is dominating, all your property values and incomes are sinking. If the upper cycle dominates, all your property values are staying the same or improving. So the question is, how do you influence those two decisions? This one is pretty important. For the person who lives there, are they going to reinvest or not? And how do you make it attractive to a new buyer? Because they can also move the price up and down a little, not as much as the reinvestor, but a little. So these are two major decisions. How can we as government or local officials influence those two? So these are the two questions. Write them out for you so you have them at home. These are the 2 points we need to look at. Luckily for us, a lot of people are interested in answers to those questions, particularly the real estate market, real estate community. They want to know how to sell houses. Builders want to know how to sell houses. These are the factors that in general, ranked in this order, go into how people decide where they're going to live. So it's no surprise, crime is number one. You don't want to live in an unsafe place. You want to live in a safe place. You want to feel safe where you live. You'd probably give up a lot if you could get safety over danger or risk. So that's number one, probably for just about everyone. Schools are number two. That doesn't apply to everybody, but it applies to a lot. It applies to enough so that on average, that's the number two most important thing. So people who are looking for a new home are saying, is it safe? Is there a good place for my kids to go to school? And they're just saying, what are the test scores? That's the primary test. Go to any real estate site and you will see this reflected. Click here for the crime map, click here for the test scores of the local school. It may not even be on the actual listing page of a lot of real estate websites now. Third level, after you get past those two, if the situation meets those criteria, they get to, do I feel in line personally, economically with this neighborhood? So I need a Starbucks every day on my way to work. Is there a Starbucks here? If there isn't, that's a problem. Maybe economically the neighborhood can't support a Starbucks or something. I'm not sure. So it's a lot of different factors of, does my income level feel similar to the people I'm moving in next to? Because if you get too far off, people start to feel uncomfortable one way or the other. Fourth on the list is how nice is the house? It's kind of funny. You get past safety and schools and, does this feel right for me? Now, how nice is the house? Fifth on the list is growth. And that refers to, is there positive stuff happening in this neighborhood or not? New business coming in, people remodeling their homes. Look like a positive activity here or not. That's fifth on the list. Sixth is transportation. which when I first looked at this, thought, wow, that is shockingly low. But then you realize, oh, everybody knows somebody who drives an hour to work, right? Why would they do that? It's low on the priority list. You get the other 4, you can put up with a long commute. And then finally, dead last is, how pretty is it? Or is there some big recreation amenity that draws me there, or something like that? So that actually is the ranking. And this is pretty well defined in real estate literature. So what makes people want to stay? Once they're there and they're trying to make that decision about whether or not to reinvest, what makes them want to stay? And it pretty much boils down to one single factor. And that's, do I believe as the homeowner in the future of this neighborhood? Is it going in the right direction or is it not? And if they answer that yes, then they're in a positive mindset for that neighborhood and they're likely to stay and make the investment and reinvest. But if they're not, they're more likely to move. So it all depends on how do they feel about the future of the place. And frankly, that reflects a great deal on the previous list for that new buyer. It's pretty much the same list that's used to determine whether or not. But there's that extra factor of, I'm already here, I'm already invested. Is this going the right way? So there's a lot of image, things that are buried in there. So then this brings us to the most important question for us, is what can you do about it? Now that you understand the problem, you understand the decisions you're trying to influence, what is it that you can do about it? Cities all across the United States are grappling with these questions. So the obvious one, when you're looking at that list, it's kind of like a to-do list, right? You look at that list, what's number 1 on there? Crime. Oh, this one back here. Crime. The good thing here is that we own this one, by and large. We do all the public safety stuff. That's us. We control it, we can change it, we can alter it, we can enhance it. Bad news for us is number 2. Schools. Nobody controls schools, near as I can tell. We can influence it a little bit, but it's tough. So, policing, enforcement, and image, those are kind of grouped together because they're sort of intimately tied. In a lot of cases, it's not just how safe your community is, but it's how safe does it feel for people, right? Because the perception is as important as the reality of it. So image, I think, is completely buried in there as well, as is broken window theory. You guys familiar with broken window theory as an idea? You got to worry about all of the built environment and all the tiny little details, making everything neat and tidy, because if you don't, it's more attractive to someone who's going to do some social dysfunction there or some criminal element. So anyway, policing, enforcement, and image, all sort of tied together. Educational enhancements are another option that cities can pursue to try to change their course and alter those decisions. Development is the most common suggested remedy for first-tier suburbs. And frankly, personally, it's a challenging one. And many of us in the room will probably face that challenge. But a lot of people in other cities will look at your first-tier suburb or your older suburban community and say, well, just develop your way out of it. Just make economic development. It'll fix everything. Not quite that simple. I'll talk about that a little bit. Regional options. A lot of different portions of the country are looking at regulatory growth controls or regional partnerships. I can talk a little bit about those. And then state and national solutions are just sort of an afterthought. Possible, not likely. So let's talk a little bit about policing and enforcement. The basic question here is where standards have fallen, and that typically is what happens in a neighborhood. People quit mowing the lawn, they start parking their car on the lawn, or they leave trash about, and then other neighbors start doing the same behaviors, and it just sort of spreads, and it becomes the new norm for a community. It becomes the new normal behavior. Where that's fallen over time, you can also raise it through enforcement or through other, carrot-oriented activities as opposed to stick-oriented activities. If you can raise those standards, just so people behave better in a neater, tidier way, you can enhance property values, improve quality of life. You can involve residents in this quite a bit too, because you will always have some core of residents who do believe in the future of the place and who are willing to do something about it. So that is a key part of the policing and enforcement. And then, of course, there is flat-out policing. You can do different types of policing than you've done before. More and more cities are doing community-oriented policing or varieties of it, targeting special actions on chronic problems, promoting neighborhood watch, try to get residents involved in making their community safer or feel safer. Code enforcement nationwide is a really big effort, and it is probably a relatively effective effort. It's probably due to you can switch code enforcement to being a very proactive force for change in your community. It's cheap compared to police, generally really true here in California, generally true nationwide, and effective, because you're dealing with the messes. And the interesting thing is the interplay between code enforcement and police. In our city, where we've done a lot of code enforcement, the police will say in any situation where you've got a chronic problem, there are code issues. And the code enforcement people will say, in any case where we've got chronic code enforcement problems, there are police issues. So they virtually just merge as one law enforcement entity. The code enforcement being perhaps the more efficient and effective partner in that partnership. So in Rancho Cordova's case, I think we've done everything on that list in one way or another. These are ideas of policing and enforcement things that can be done. You can do proactive apartment inspections. In our case, we try to get through every apartment in our city within a 5-year period, and we're trying to see if we can shrink that to 3. So you don't let properties slide into decay under slumlords, because there are a bunch of owners out there who would naturally do that. You can work with an apartment association, as we did here in Sacramento, and they will actually come out and support higher fines, higher fees, and more inspections, which they did in our case. They're not a barrier to that, because they represent the good guys. And the bad guys hurt their industry, so they're willing to work on that front. Commercial corridor enhancements, through investments in infrastructure, typically. Rental home inspections, similar to apartment inspections. Transient enforcement. If you've got transient enforcement is probably going to be an issue in your community. Keeping that and dealing with transients in an effective and humane way is I think a challenge nationwide, but certainly one here in California as well. People deal with that in a variety of ways. Probation sweeps are something we've started in Rancho Cordova and other jurisdictions have as well. We actually have 2 probation officers who work at the city full time and do nothing but monitor our probationers in Rancho Cordova at a slightly higher level than they would get otherwise in the unincorporated county. And so word sort of gets out. If you're a probationer and you want to live somewhere, if you live in Rancho Cordova, your door's going to get knocked on. Live somewhere else, not as often. That's just our attempt to try to mediate how many probationers we have living in Rancho Cordova and to monitor them at a higher rate. Light rail fare sweeps, a very big issue for my city. I think it's probably a big issue for most cities that have light rail or mass transit. In a situation like ours where it's sort of an honor system, I can tell you one recent data point we've got, and I think it's really relevant for the region. We asked our police department what % of crime along Folsom Boulevard, where light rail runs parallel to Folsom Boulevard from one end of town to the other, what % of crime along Folsom Boulevard involved someone who did not live in our community, who had a residence elsewhere? The number was 70%. 70%. Of that percentage, how many didn't have a car? It was like 85% did not have a car. How did they get there?
See, because 70% of the YOLO crimes are committed by Rancho.
That must be it. Everybody leaves home to commit the crime. Huh? It's a shocking number in any case.
Who were the victims?
Rancho Cordovans, primarily.
Primarily.
Well, and each other, I suppose. If I could boil it down that far, I would. But light rail fare sweeps have to be a part of how we deal with that. It's just too giant of a crime number to ignore. And then there's all kinds of specific areas, specific enforcement actions that can be done by police or code enforcement. And you can also use technology. We have a program that's using GIS basically to identify the hot spots and then focus resources on those hot spots to try to get them off the list for next year. That sort of activity. So all this falls under policing and enforcement. And once again, this is an area we own. So there's a lot we can do about it. And there are a lot of good nationwide models for people who are doing similar activities. In Rancho Cordova, we call it growing strong neighborhoods. This is the sort of problem we saw 10 years ago. Did I show this slide last time?
Yeah. Yes.
I had you guys figure out how many problems there were in one picture. Yeah, it's a lot. You can't find that anymore, but that was not uncommon 12 years ago. So in growing strong neighborhoods, which is our effort to address a lot of those policing and enforcement issues and image issues, we have about that many different efforts that we've undertaken so far, and we're working on a new one right now in line with that GIS point that I just made, trying to focus resources exactly where the problem is coming from and focus there on a sustained way to try to see if you can move those problem properties off the list that you've made for the subsequent years. So we've done citywide sweeps using code enforcement in every city department, a few county departments, proactively around town, rental property inspection, multiple ordinance and zoning updates, have some innovative, I think, vagrancy enforcement issues, done some beautification, focused on neighborhood watch, done a ton on volunteerism and civic engagement. These are things I think we as a region could talk about. You know, what we've done, what you've done, in a similar category to figure out what strategies would best work for all of us. This is just an example I wanted to throw up of Rancho, so I'm going to skip that. Citizen engagement, another trend you see nationwide. People talk about this, civic engagement, in a lot of different ways. I just gave a talk at the League of Cities last week, and one of my jokes was, you know, people do things because they're fun. And because they're fun, people want to do them. It's a huge motivator in life. It's like a basic psychological need. And government isn't very good at fun, right? I mean, right? We're not good at fun. We're not so great at fun. As a matter of fact, we're so not great at fun. What do we call it? Civic engagement. Sort of case in point, right? But below that debate, we have often put out this knowledge that, you know, or this notion that government can fix everything. Got a problem? Bring it to government. We'll create a program. We'll fix it. We probably never could do that. We certainly can't do that now. You have to have citizens engaged in fixing things. And so civic engagement, whether it's part of your image or sort of your public safety or part of your beautification, has to be a part of the solution. You can't do this all as government. You have to find partners, and citizens are your obvious partners. So I'm going to skip Blight busters, image enhancements. These are pretty effective. I've seen in other cities around the country. And it's where you basically want to, you sort of brand yourself, you can market yourself, there are a lot of different ways into trying to enhance your image. The bottom line is you want it to be real, so don't lie about your city. There's all sorts of stories we can make up about ourselves that we wish were true, but you have to be true in what you say. Now you can amplify those great things, because all of us have great things in our communities. Amplify those, but don't lie about yourselves. That's one big takeaway. The arts seem to be a cheap way to get a lot of image bang. There are a lot of artists. I suspect there are several of us here in the room who may wish to remain anonymous, but all of us have some basic interest in art. And if you can unleash that in your community, any community, you can have a lot of positive image gains from that and more civic engagement as a result. Faith-based and other nonprofit partners are also a huge key to achieving greater image enhancement. So you have to think about all those folks as partners. Development as a solution. So I'm working down that list of things that cities have tried. This is the one, once again, most often pointed to. For the old suburban area, just go develop and fix it. The problem is, in those old suburban areas, you may not have the income to do development, right? Because the developer comes along, they want to draw a circle, or they want to use a map, show the driving distance to my site, and when they do that, the income map is terrible. Because your incomes have fallen so far, no one wants to take a risk on a development in an area where they don't have supportive income, or they'll choose the area with higher income over yours. The other big challenge is existing infrastructure. So, you know, in our case in Rancho Cordova and Folsom Boulevard, people need to fix the water, they need to fix the drainage, they need to fix the electricity system, they need to fix the sewer. All those costs are sort of in place, added on top of whatever it is they're going to build in the first place. If they're building a new greenfield, none of those costs apply. They're going to pay some fees, but it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper to do in greenfield as opposed to infill. So that's another existing challenge for just develop your way out of it. Now this is what I love this comparison. So a lot of us have this in the older suburban areas. That's what development looked like. And the new Urbanists solved all of our problems. They said, simple, just build that. Just turn that into that. Put apartment buildings and parking garages. No problem, right? Easy to do. Not so easy to do. In a case where your incomes are so low, no one can afford to rent there, or people who would want to rent there would be too scared by the crime in the neighborhood. There's a lot of challenges to just that easy sort of new urbanist development. So you've got to think about other development options. In a lot of cases, these suburban communities don't have downtowns. You might have to try to create a downtown or create a feeling of a downtown or micro downtown or something. So most suburbs lack those downtown features. You can use historic preservation. Some cities are doing that across the country. A lot of cities using brownfield remediation to sort of clear the way for development. And there are a lot of economic development programs out there that are focused on trying to become what you already are, amplify what you've got, play to your strengths, grow what you have. That seems to be the cutting edge in older suburban areas with respect to economic development. School enhancements, major issue, extremely difficult for a city to deal with. The quote I put up there, it's like turning an ocean liner. And I think all of us have probably frustrations with our local school district. There are a lot of, probably hundreds of different partnership examples out there. I don't have a lot of insight into which is better than any particular other partnership, but certainly League of Cities has, both state and national, has a lot of resources talk about different sort of school enhancements that can be done. It's number 2 on our list. It really can't be ignored. Ranks too high, but very difficult to address. Housing rehabilitation. You have to be able to compete in the housing as you're working your way down that list again. At some point you get to housing quality. You can find ways as a city to ease the remodeling cost, right? Make it easier. People have gone out and done idea books, and it actually works pretty well in suburbs where you've got cookie cutter houses, because you can have an architect draw 7 varieties of an upgrade for this type of cookie cutter house, of which you have 4,500 in your city. And then a homeowner could look at those and say, oh, I want option 3, you know, and saves them a lot of costs, and they know what they're getting. A lot of the risk and variables and fear can be taken away if you have sort of idea books to stimulate that. You see some cities that are going in and doing specific rehabs of a number of homes in a neighborhood. The challenge there is you might have 1,000 homes in a neighborhood, and you can afford to fix 2. Are you going to move the dial on the value of homes in the neighborhood with the 2? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there's another strategy. But these are what cities are thinking about. Affordable housing rehab, this is the one resource that well, we used to have a lot of access to. We may once again. But the caution is, if your problem in the old suburb is declining median income, adding affordable housing is not necessarily a fix. So there's actually a ULI comment on that you need to be cautious about trying to fix the downtrodden old suburban area by adding more affordable housing, because what you're probably doing is swapping what is effectively affordable housing for new sort of mandated affordable housing, or has more standards or rules associated with it. So be careful in how that's done. Then you get further down the list of what you could do. Can the state come help us? Can the region come help us? Limited, obviously, with the state. We've seen redevelopment, for example, go away. We've seen what was called? Enterprise zones go away. I forgot what they were called. But you do see some, particularly in other states, regional associations of first tier governments who are working together to try to address regional level problems. So in our case, the example might be what fees are charged by regional sewer providers or water providers or things like that. That could be addressed by an association of regional local governments or first tier governments. You also see them in other states lobbying their state capitals for legislation to relieve them of some sort of a burden. So that development is easier, for example, in those older suburban communities. That's something we could consider as a group as an option. Don't really see any silver bullet out there for how to fix old suburban areas in other states. There's some growth controls that some states have tried with varying success. I'm not going to go into details there, but you don't really see a clear fix in any of those cases. And national policy is hardly worth mentioning. We still get CDBG dollars for now. Not likely to go on for long. It's not enough to fix a lot of things. It comes with so many rules, it's kind of hard to figure out how you effectively use it. Hope 6 grants, most suburban areas don't end up qualifying for those in the end. And empowerment zones, you know, they are accessible to some cities elsewhere in the country, not really currently to us here in California. Federal options, so they're very limited, and growth control measures, sort of, you don't know if it would work or not, and certainly that would be a political step too far, I think, in the Sacramento region. So, what can be done? In summary, I've gone through the whole list, but in summary, the greatest route to success that I've seen looking at this issue all over the country appears to be in policing, enforcement, and image. Those things can move the needle in a given community. In development, if you focus on specific economic development, reinvention, enhancing what you have, that seems to be successful. I'm not sure I can point to a lot of successes elsewhere that have actually changed the course of a suburban community. But in some cases, I think I see signs of that. And regional partnerships, the third arrow down here, seems like an opportunity worth pursuing. And that's actually probably the reason why we're sitting here. I'd like to inform you about the others, and we could talk about way we could enhance our own programs in the region, but the big bang for us might be, how as a region can we address these? What partnerships could we form that would help all of us in our suburban development types improve our citizens' lives? So that is my, I'm out of time, that is my talk for today.
Thank you, David.
Questions, comments, dialogue?
Yeah, I do. I do. Thank you, David. That was really great, and I really felt it was so relevant to my community that you were speaking about, because where I live in the South Union County, Beale Air Force Base played a big part in it back in the 60s and 70s and encouraged development to come to the South County for military. So you've seen these mature suburban areas being developed in areas like Linden and Oliver's. One of the things that I really resented is that the developers that built these homes for military, they didn't want to be associated with Linden and Oliver's, so they made sure that the zip code was Marysville. And these people, even today, actually think that they're part of the city of Marysville, which really makes me mad. I've changed that. The other thing is that the image about, it's not only just the image, it's about how we feel about ourselves in those communities and how others see us. And one of the things, when I got elected 14 years ago, Oliver's was devastated by 2 big floods. A lot of these folks never recovered economically, socially, or how they felt about their community. So the first thing I did was we did this volunteer thing. I partnered with the local landfill, and we did 1 day of community cleanup, always the same month. And I have like 100 people come out and spend their Saturday. It's one of the biggest cleanups in the region, but what it's done is it's actually given people a little bit more pride about how they feel about their neighborhoods. The broken window theory is very important in this regards, because you see somebody cleaning up yours, all of a sudden they want to clean up theirs. And that has been one of the biggest things. So I also work with the school district, because schools are number 2 on the list, as you said, and we've partnered together, spending money where it should be spent up to make it safe to get to school and come back. So what you've gone through is everything that I've gone through in my community. But what's the gratifying part of it is now seeing the development of new retail, new homes. I probably have more commercial retail than any other district in my county. And it's also because of the investment that SACOG has made in regards to making my streets safer, smarter, and built, with the idea of people walking. So I think it can be done. I think we can all learn a lesson from what we're doing that's working in our community. But I just want to thank you, because what you said today really describes what I'm going through, the process that I'm going through.
To dovetail on that, I think one of the things you look at is nationally. I look at New York City, and they did a great job in New York City. When Giuliani got elected, his 2 top priorities was graffiti and the squeegee men who would assault you as you came into town. I was talking to the police commissioner, and he said we thought he was a lunatic, but it was amazing that he took care of those 2 issues as his top priority, and major crimes dropped dramatically. And it kind of goes back to the adage, you take care of the small stuff, the big stuff takes care of itself. So, excellent presentation on that.
Just on the school side, we have to figure out.
You have some expertise there, Chris?
I do, but not a lot more hopeful. But we have to figure it out. Right?
We have to figure it out.
You can't pass it over, and there's not simple, easy ones. A large part of the school performance stuff, though, is driven by teacher quality, and a major part of that issue in these, as we're learning from the downtown and the urban core stuff, and it's true in the First Tier Suburbs as well, is if the best quality teachers don't want to live in that neighborhood and teach in that school, there's no amount of donations of iPads or even safe routes or other things. I mean, you're just making it you're making it easier for kids to get access to mediocre or bad teachers, and we haven't really paid attention to that. So I know one thing we're trying to look at is how can we deploy our very limited affordable housing resources, for example, in ways that as we used to have, we previously targeted for seniors and other populations. How can we, now that we don't have any state or federal money to help, and we just have to do what we think is right, can we do that in a way, for example, that specifically oriented around creating communities and support for high quality teachers to be in neighborhoods that they wouldn't otherwise be? If you don't solve that, you could try charter schools as well, and that can be an effective means, but I mean, if you don't take on the issue of the quality of education that's occurring at that school, a lot of these challenges are hard to overcome. In some ways, worse than they are in the urban core, because I can populate neighborhoods, on the waterfront full of lofts where they're just, and hope that people move there because they don't have kids. But in these, in the first tier suburb parts of my city, the housing is too big for that. Right? I mean, it's silly for people, for couples who don't have any intention of having kids or for empty nesters to move from one large house to another large or medium-sized house. So the school issues, I think, are going to become more critical to solving this challenge than they have been on the urban side. The other thing is, I mean, we debate the broken window stuff all the time internally because the research is actually quite mixed in terms of the actual outcomes on broken windows. It's one of those. I was a huge proponent of it for the first 8 years I've been in office, and we still pay a lot of attention to it. But it's not magic either. There's a lot of mixed evidence about relative to other strategies, whether it is as effective as you would think based on how plainly obvious it seems. So it's a caution that you ought to, as you dive into a specific place, to contextualize that in terms of what is the actual research, what are police experts have to say about that, and is broken windows, is that going to be as effective in dealing with revitalizing parts of Carmichael as it is parts of Alkali Flats? I mean, there are different places with different kinds of enforcement challenges, and that theory in particular, I think, deserves a little bit more attention by those of us in local office.
Well, we probably have a similar experience there, both having come from a place with not a lot of code enforcement, then suddenly you started. You can have a dramatic effect for a while, but then you get to the point of how clean is clean, right?
That's right.
So there would be diminishing returns, I think, on that.
Yeah, if the glass is broken, it's a big problem. If the lock on the window is not working, that's not as big.
Not as obvious.
Not a big of an impact.
I've asked David to attend a winter's city council workshop, and we've also included the school board now. So I just wanted to let you know
great.
because I think
I have to modify what I say.
It's really
Here's the problem.
but I think it's important to say because we have worked really hard on the education piece. So we're rolling out next week at the schools, and I've been instrumental in helping through the California Emerging Technology Fund, is to get school-to-home program started for the 6th graders. And so we're rolling out that project so that each kid can take a Chromebook home, provided their parent comes to training, and which we're hoping that'll kind of boost even economic development, and so families can actually figure out how to use one of these at home and get their doctor's appointments or whatever it might be. But I think it's, for us right now, we're just on the edge of having 71 homes being built, and I'm encouraged by this presentation because I think I've talked to our city manager, and he gets it, and I need my planning commissioners to understand. We need to make sure that we figure out some kind of funding mechanisms to re-asphalt some of those our suburbs, fix the sidewalks, make them proud of where they're living, because there will be a shift. I know for a fact. I've always had families say, "I can't wait to move to a bigger home." So I have also elderly that want to move into senior housing. So there's a lot going on, and I really am looking forward to seeing the reaction. In fact, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to invite some of our local developers so they can, and see if they can help me fix up those other parts of town. But I'm looking forward to it.
I have a question for the group that's motivated by Christopher's question to Gordon about how we define the aging suburbs and so does it seem to people that because there isn't just one clear cut off the shelf way that you define those, and so the general question to the group is does it seem to people that the areas that we have defined, that David through his research has and that we have through this other research, that there's a there, that there's something distinctive about that particular part of our region that distinguishes it from other parts of the region. And part of my motive is because then that allows us to focus and learn more and make sure whatever we're doing here at SACOG is, appropriately as helpful as we can be to those areas. But also we have this really rich database now that we've just barely started to scratch the surface, I think, of the learning of it. And, we're interested in what kinds of questions we can sort of answer through that. So, I don't know, hopefully that's the focus of the question to see if it seems like we're talking about some place that makes sense to you, or do we have these, does that urban subgeography of this region not hang together as logically as we're kind of sort of thinking it does?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't understand your question.
Neither.
I was trying to figure out how the statistics that he discussed, what were you trying to tell us? How are we supposed to use that information? I'm dense, I guess. I don't.
I'll answer that question. We're still trying to figure that out. As I say, we're at the front end. I think there's a general presumption. You, Director Peters, have voiced this in certain ways, David and others in their own ways, that the suburbs need more attention here at SACOG. And so, partly what I'm asking is, are those the suburbs you think need more attention?
Here's the map.
We have the geography
Does that look
defined
right?
correctly, so we can, focus our efforts and try to help.
Well, it depends what the help looks like, right? So, because the distinction that David had described from HUD, the distressed or whatever that definition was, I think is I'm not really, I'm not hugely concerned about, the Greenhaven and West Davis. The parts of that meet that time frame category, but they would fall into your elite suburb definition for a lot of reasons are not. They're not experiencing those same factors. So thinking about what that to create a little bit more fine-grained lens. The basic map to me made sense. But I was asking because I didn't understand the next slide why that was such a surprise. That was all. Not that the map itself made sense to me. It was just like, well, if we say that mature suburbs are those things built between 1950 and 1980. And then we look at the map and say, well, look, oh my God, most of built between 1950 and 1980 was mature suburbs. That seemed like not that huge revelation.
Well, you could have let me push back a little bit on that. You could have a region whose growth, and I could name a few for you, and whose percentage of total regional growth in those decades was not as high in the suburbs compared to what that chart defines as the central city.
Right. Tell us what those are. Give us some examples.
I understood what I think what it was saying is that look, we disposed of each area as we've gone out. So we had the central city area, and then we basically stopped growing there, and then grew here. Right. And we stopped growing there, and then grew here. So I think I got that. It's just that also was not a surprise, right? No, since we all live here, I think that was what motivated the conversation for the first time around. So it wasn't that it was wrong or anything. It was just when Gordon said, and I was taken aback at these numbers. That's the part that was I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing some nuance that that I just wasn't hearing. So.
We in Rockland are underway right now. We've hired a consultant for a land economic study. We're doing that now. It should be done here in November or whatever. One of the pieces I didn't hear much in here was just optimal zoning. And we're looking at we'll be built out, and we're doing a lot of infill things now, and we're kind of reevaluating the zoning, enhancing our zoning to attract maybe a more desirable type of build, right? And I think that's going to be part of this discussion to some degree. I know that's not the top 2 or 3. You can't develop your way out of the problems, but I think that makes a big impact on a neighborhood.
Well, if I can just sort of riff off of that for a minute, to that extent, as I look at those numbers and the geometry of central area and then what used to be the new suburbs and are now the old suburbs, and then the new suburbs after that. And now we see for a variety of reasons, the central city area here and in most metropolitan areas in the country start to increase in growth again. A lot of, I think, is what's in play, and what we're counting on in the MTP and the blueprint is that what are on that chart labeled the older suburbs, that we also get the infill growth and the revive, the sort of techniques that David is highlighting in that part, that those work, whether it's rezoning or regulatory reform through SEQA or something, that the sort of the upswing that we're just starting to see an inkling of in the central core, that we get that in those established suburbs as well. I think that's very much in play in this region. To what extent that's going to happen, and how quickly, and to what, how robust it's going to be.
I mean, part of what motivates me for this discussion is just the size of that area.
Right.
You
A
know,
lot of homes.
this is a vast population base lives in that mature suburb areas labeled there.
Yeah.
If we don't find a good way to treat that, to maintain that, to improve that, I don't know where we are 20 years from now.
But isn't Scott right? I mean, I guess the central city, we were trying to like revitalize, bring it back, right? Because we've had centuries of human settlement in that style of development. So it has proven before that it could work.
Right.
We're trying to, okay, how do we make this work again? We don't really have that with this 1950 to 1980 style of development.
New ground, exactly.
There isn't really a stable period where we can demonstrate in human history that this style of settlement actually is sustainable.
Right.
And so, in addition to making sure it doesn't decline for all those strategies that we've described, issues around retrofitting and rezoning and rethinking how the place works without trying to make it in a downtown or into a farmland. We have to invent some new strategies in that way as well. It's not just about restoring them to their glory.
You know, I see maybe 30 years from now that those blue areas are going to be those brown areas, because, during the housing boom, we've seen so many houses go up, and sometimes quality was always compromised. And so they're going to fall apart maybe even sooner than the ones that we're dealing with today. But for me, as far as SACOG is concerned, there are things that you mentioned, David, that I'm not familiar with, that I may be a tool for our areas. And I'm speaking from a county, rural area, not from the city's perspective, but like inspection rentals, we don't do that. Or how about Hope 6 grants and empowerment zones? I'm not familiar with anything like that might be able to help my district. So maybe that's information sharing that can happen in order to try to give us tools to work with that we're not familiar with.
I have a couple of observations here. I think that I have a hard time using the word suburb and applying it to many of the places that I see in the region based on what I understand the history to be. So I don't see, for example, Woodland being a classic suburb of what? I don't see that. Davis started as its own identity. It is growing as time changes. The role that each of these communities performs in the region moves to a different changes, evolves. But I think that the term suburb itself is outdated in a lot of ways, and as we look forward to what these areas on this map, what function they serve in the region in the future, I don't see them as a ring of suburbs that's concentric circles from what. I see them as
suburban style development is what we're really talking about, rather than
but
suburb as a unit.
I'm not sure that helps me to define what might need to take place. Just looking at this now, I know that in the Yolo County area that's identified as blue around, that I don't see as a newer suburb. Frankly, that would be a travesty. That's what took place. Well, optimistic to some, and
off limits.
Well, dismal. Yeah, right. Dismal.
I mean, just that geography is the fact that there's large census tracts around the edges of Davis and Woodland, and census tract is the only unit of data that we have for this, and so the growth probably happened in one corner, clearly, on the edges of those two cities, but the whole geography gets tagged that way.
So the thought-provoking discussion that we're having, I think sets up an interesting discussion about where does it go in the future. Because I don't see this automatically becoming what was just what Mary Jane, what you said, if the blue areas become brown. I think that if we do nothing, that is likely, but I think this gives us sort of a prediction of the future if we don't do something.
Yeah, it applies to new development. You know, if you don't have a mechanism in there to replace those parks when they're broken, when the pool breaks, you know, that's going to cause a decline in the neighborhood. You have to have some sort of financing mechanism in there to fix everything.
So one part of this could be that another way of thinking about it is that area that's shown in the center, and that's the central city, I assume is the area around downtown, midtown Sacramento. I think that's changing. That the central core of our region is frankly going to be different. 20 years from now, Christopher, you're going to see West Sacramento with the connections around being the central city, not an aging suburb, but something new. I think that's happening all around the region in different ways. So I'm kind of interested in what the new nomenclature ought to be.
Well, in the census tract, we also, I mean, like, when I first saw it, I thought, well, the Data suburb, that's a suburb of the original Davis, but that gets swamped in the census tract geography, and that's true in virtually every town in the region. You don't see that these suburbs are suburbs of themselves. They're not them as opposed to being suburbs of downtown.
Is it possible for SACOG to break that down into block groups rather than census tracts? Because I see that there's a lot of anomalies in there that I think are explained by using the census tract.
We explored that, and just given the resources we had, census tracts was sort of the geography we had to compromise around, because the big data management challenge of this was, these are all on 2010 census tracts. Each census has a different set of census tracts. So those other three time periods, we had to reconcile the census tract data on those geographies to current census tracts, which is very complicated and messy and full of approximations, data processing.
But,
So
but Gordon, we had to do that for the data that we had to analyze. It doesn't mean we have to do that in a policy discussion of what programs and investments and whatnot. We got access to a really unique data set, which is, several decades worth of empirical data, national scale. So we could really look for sort of strong correlations. Are these the kind of things that lead to bad things, and are these the kind of things that lead to good things? But in terms of working with the board on, where do you want to go with this, we have parcel specific data to work with. We don't have some of the census law.
I just think it would be more useful.
I mean, that's the trade-off. For today, for the 2010 census, we can dig down to very small geographies. We just aren't able to do that level into the package.
Right.
Dave, have you tried, I know some of the people in my community said that they don't want to improve their homes because of the, financial, you improve your home, you get the supplemental tax, Is there the permit process and the cost of that? Is there any program out there that, especially for those that are on, fixed incomes, is there anything out there that says, a policy change to show that there's some incentive for folks to do those improvements?
There are a lot of programs that float around the edges of that, but they're all such limited resource that it's sort of hard to say this works. But yeah, there's any number of home remodeling assistance or targeted for veterans or all sorts of things.
There is.
But they're always just nipping a few houses here and a few houses there.
Right. So the state gets the majority of our property tax. So what do I care if we don't assess them? As far as I'm concerned, but I don't know what the legal repercussions of that is.
That could be an interesting discussion.
You go to jail.
David, I have a question. So I'm curious in your research. What I'm finding in my area, and That's most of that orange area up
Yeah.
there, or brown up there.
Right next to my brown area.
Yeah, the trouble with the commercial parcels for redevelopment are that they're shaped completely different, inappropriately for current standards for retailers, and so it's very difficult, and I've been working with that mantra. That's one thing. And then, however, in the last couple of months, I've had numerous shopping centers be purchased and with large investments. Country Club Plaza was purchased. $30 million in addition to the purchase price is going to go into that. Town and Country Village, Donnie Shriver bought that, and they dumped a bunch of money into it. Taylor Center, right across the street from that, they dumped several tens of millions into that. Town and Country West is being purchased. They're going to dump a bunch of money into that. Auto dealers are moving on to Auburn Boulevard into weird-shaped lots, tying some of them together. So I relate that to the price finally got to a point where they could afford to buy it. That's the only thing I can think of, because that's not an area where the income's going up, right? So, except how do you apply that to the homes in the area? Because those homes, about 50% of them are rentals now. And people have moved out, they're not keeping them up. I mean, the majority of them are, but it's enough to run the neighborhood down. So, have you bumped into that kind of scenario? Where
Not exactly in Rancho Cordova, although I can tell you we have a similar exception to the general rule, like what you're describing. Rivergate Plaza, purchased and remodeled, a lot of money thrown at it.
And I forgot to mention, how about Arden? They bought the theaters. They bought How About Arden? They bought 2 other shopping centers. They're knocking down a motel. I mean, it's going to be a huge development on the corner. I mean, it's just.
It appears to be, in our case, the one case I've got, it appears to be the people who are driving by have a lot of money. So let's appeal to them. The neighborhood, not as important. So it's sort of the traffic shed that's driving by that becomes the market.
But how do you connect that with housing that just, you would
I
think
guess
the
that would be
prices
an
are low
amenity.
enough that people would buy them and reinvest.
I guess it would be an amenity for the housing, but we haven't established a culture in our region of a lot of people wanting to go back and move into these old suburban areas. I don't know if anybody actually has in the country, with a couple of exceptions. University towns can do it. As a university grows, the rental prices go up, and eventually people buy the houses and fix them up and all the property values.
No one can
That
afford to
works,
rent
but
then.
that's a major attractor. So in fact, I don't think shopping is going to have that major attractor.
Well, it's just kind of an interesting,
Yeah.
it's one of your amenities on your list.
Yep.
And the other is just a data point on statistics. I've also found out in the last few months that my district is being affected by the war in Syria. And because I've had over 6,000 Syrian refugees locate within a couple block area in my district. They're people who've moved from country to country, bounced here, bounced there, don't have anywhere else to go. And from what I can figure out, they're coming to the U.S. either because they helped the U.S. government while they were there, or they have nowhere else to go, and we're just kind of shuffling them around from country to country. And that's something that's happened very, very fast. So, I've had to get the Arab American Learning Center and the schools involved and trying to get them English. And when they sit down and say, if we don't get these kids, educated, they're going to be upset and turn to more, angry Muslims.
Yeah. Well, you got the cheapest housing in a suburban area. That's the cheapest housing in the region. So,
you get a couple of families that locate there, and the word goes forward.
And a lot of turnover. So once
every
it starts
4 years.
and seed is planted.
But we're going to have a special section in our health and welfare building down the street on Fulton. So that's just in the last couple of years. So some of the statistics may or may be skewed a little bit.
They're the home to new immigrants now, the older suburbs.
Yeah, because they're inexpensive, and then that has a tendency to drive the prices down further.
So it seems like there's quite a bit of interest in. There are issues that are cross-cutting. There probably is a definable geographic area or type of area that probably does call for some considered strategy. How that unfolds, where it falls with transportation infrastructure or with any of the other aspects of the work that we